I think that it is interesting the level of or the lack of interest that I've seen in these developments when it goes in one direction versus where I think it was going, where other amounts of interest that have come from this room and beyond.
Press Secretary Sean Spicer noting a, quote, interesting lack of interest when reporters asked for the administration's reaction to a report from Bloomberg today that former National Security Advisor Susan Rice had asked for the unmasking of Team Trump members in intelligence reports during the Trump transition. Now, joining us to discuss, I want to bring in James Jeffries, a former Deputy National Security Advisor under President George W. Bush, and Hugh Hewitt, MSNBC contributor and host of the Hugh Hewitt radio show. And if Sean Spicer's watching, we're talking about this, just so everybody knows. We're actually having this discussion. Let me start with you, James. I want to separate the idea that there was surveillance from the idea that Susan Rice, who was a national security advisor, asked for that information, unmasked it perhaps, from the idea that somebody leaked it. Those are three separate things.
Three separate things. The surveillance, if we can trust Chairman Nunes, was legal in all of the things that he saw, which is presumably what the White House is kind of leaking right now. Secondly, she had to make a formal request, we believe, to the National Security Agency to unmask names. This is something you can't just do for the fun of it, and you have to provide a justification. What was that justification? Finally, what did she do with this? Because these names did not leak. The only person who's been leaked in this entire issue has been General Flynn, and that was related to Russia, which, again, Nunes says is not involved here.
Hugh, so let's make sense of this then. What are we mad at Susan Rice for doing? She was the National Security Advisor. According to James Jeffries, she had the ability to ask for those names. No law was broken. What are we mad about?
I'm not mad at anything yet, Ollie. Eli Lake makes clear in his Bloomberg piece that what she did is in fact legal. It's unusual, though, and the pattern and practice has got to be revealed. I think she needs to be called before the Senate and House Intelligence Committees to ask why she requested unmasking, how often she did so, and with whom did she share, if anyone. We don't know if she shared it with anyone. Why did she do so? There's a series of questions here that go to whether or not, while this does not appear to involve General Flynn yet, it did in fact involve General Flynn, because the fear, not yet proven, is that National Security Advisor Rice swept up a bunch of what ought to have been minimized names and identities and left them lying around in places where they would make their way to the press. General Mike Hayden has speculated that.
You had me until left them lying around in places where they would be picked up by the press. There has been zero reporting on that. No one has suggested that.
No, Mike Flynn was leaked. Mike Flynn was leaked. That was a felony. Somebody created
you just said she swept up a bunch of names and left them somewhere where they could be leaked to the press.
I'm saying that's what we need to find out, if she did that. I'm saying we need to find out and have her testify to that point.
James, as the National Security Advisor, and you were the Deputy National Security Advisor, if you had an intelligence report, raw intelligence, and you wanted the names of people therein unmasked for your own purposes or reasons that you needed in the government, who would you have to explain that to?
You'd have to explain that to the agency that owns the intelligence. But to just add, these things are listed as U.S. person number 1, U.S. person number 2. The game we would play when we saw raw intelligence, and it usually took us 5 seconds, was to figure out who it was. So I think this is very curious that she would ask for these names to be unmasked, because, as I said, we normally could figure out who it is.
So what is that? Follow that line of thought for me. Where does that go? If you think it's curious that you would ask who it is, what does that imply?
We need to see the documentation that she used to justify to, again, the National Security Agency, this U.S. citizen needs to be unmasked. If this was a FISA case, that is a foreign source inside the United States, very, very strong inhibitions against this. But even if you're tapping somebody's lines overseas, you're not supposed to do this without a justification. So what was the justification?
Okay, so you and Hugh are in the same place on this, that where do we get the, what is the justification for doing this? But Hugh, I want to bring this back to, now we're looking at three different things, right? We're looking at surveillance of the Trump team as it relates to Russia, incidental or not. We're looking for the unmasking of names, and then we're looking at the dissemination of names. The White House would have you lump last two together and say that that's the serious issue that we should all be investigating. It's sort of what Sean Spicer implied, versus others who think that the issue is whether or not the Trump campaign had relations with Russian officials. Which one's more important to you?
By far the most important issue is, what did Russia do, and what are they going to do in the future? What is their cyber capability to attack United States elections and the United States government? I think the ambassador will agree with me on that. That's what the Burr-Warner hearings are focused on, because that's a threat to the future. The second most important issue, and the FBI is investigating this, is whether or not anyone among the Trump circle had inappropriate contacts with anyone within the Russia sphere of influence. And then number three, did Susan Rice, Ben Rhodes, and other people violate law and policy by attempting to create newspaper stories damaging to Team Trump as they entered into power?
So that hierarchy,
they're all important.
Right, but that hierarchy seems to make a lot of sense.
Important.
Right. You understand there are Republicans who don't follow that hierarchy. They actually think the most important thing is number three that you said, and that seems to be a distraction effort by some people. It does. I mean, Sean Spicer, I'm not sure, would agree with what you just laid out there.
Well, I talked to Sean on my show last week, and he's just as frustrated that no one is paying any attention to Silo 3, while Silo 2 gets all the attention, and not much attention is paid to Silo 1. In my opinion, 50 to 70% goes to Silo 1, and then the Silos 2 and 3 are equally important.
Okay, fair enough. James, what do you think of that? When you divide up these silos, let's talk about that third one that the administration and many Republicans say the media doesn't spend enough time on. Who leaked this stuff? How important is that to you?
Well, once again, if the only leak we have is General Flynn's leak, it's hard to see why this is a major issue. And in the case of Flynn, we were in a position where Flynn, as a national security advisor, could have been blackmailed and turned into an agent by the Russians after he had said things publicly and had people like Vice President Pence say things publicly that the Russians knew weren't true, because they, of course, had tapes of the transcripts themselves. So that was a very serious problem. So if you're ever going to justify a leak, believe me, that's the leak to justify. But we're talking about supposedly dozens of Susan Rice requests. Why was she doing it, and what happened to them? Because they clearly didn't come into the public sector.
Gentlemen, a fruitful discussion. Thank you for having it with me. James Jeffrey and
Ali.
Hugh Hewitt. Look forward to talking to you both again.